Where is it that you sense God in your life? Where is it that you can say, truly, God was here? If we're to hazard a guess, I think for most of us, we have the sense of that in the grand, in the great gestures of our faith, in some sort of spectacle or shock and awe moment. And surely God is there in some ways. I've told you several of my own personal stories where in the midst of worship, or usually actually in the midst of worship, God's presence is remarkably there. So perhaps that is the case. We find him there in the midst of some great and beautiful liturgy. If I started getting the incense out, maybe all y'all would feel a little bit more like, there he is. I can smell him. Perhaps in some great and beautiful liturgical thing, perhaps in the grandeur of nature, being out, seeing mountains or grand forests or the ocean. Perhaps just hearing the stories of God's mighty acts, what he did for the Israelites in Egypt, what he did for Israel in the book of Judges or elsewhere. Maybe comes to mind something like the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, right? He's up there on the mountain, the fire comes down, and he in awe says, "Written by the finger of God." That's terrible. That wasn't a good impression, sorry. Or if you're maybe of my era, DreamWorks picture The Prince of Egypt, telling the same story, kind of a different perspective, but the same kind of grand moments, the spectacles of our faith. We want God to be there in those spectacular things. We want to be present with shock and awe in the magnificent presence of God. We want God to make his presence known in ways that are obvious, ways that cannot be doubted, so that we might, in fear and trembling, worship him. We want God in his great transcendent awesomeness. And if it's not there, we might think he's not there. And though these things are indeed greater than us, and God does appear in great spectacle, more often it seems he appears in the quiet, in the mundane. That was the case for Elijah in our Old Testament reading this morning. In the context, Elijah had just had a great mountaintop experience, quite literally a mountaintop. He was up on Mount Carmel, where he basically enacted a showdown between the false god Baal and the true God, Yahweh, where the prophets of Baal were asked to call on their god that he might send fire down on a sacrifice, and nothing happened, and they wailed all day, and nothing came of it. Finally, Elijah steps up and pours water upon water upon water on this sacrifice and offers a small prayer to God, and suddenly it lights, fire striking it from heaven. He has this remarkable experience, and then he flees, because the king and queen of Israel at the time, Ahab and Jezebel, sought his life. They were not worshipers of Yahweh God, but of Baal, and so he runs from them. And he runs then to the one place he knows that God has been present, to Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, the place where God came down to give the Israelites the law, where he met with Moses, where there was indeed shock and awe, so much so that the Israelites wouldn't even get close when they were invited in, but rather sent Moses and said, "You go talk to God, and you come back and talk to us. We don't want to talk to him." And so Elijah heads to Mount Horeb. He climbs the mountain. And the text tells us that while up there, there is the sound of fire and wind and earthquake. But God was not in any of those things. Wind that moved boulders, fire on the mountain, and an earthquake. And instead, then, after all these things, there's the sound of sheer silence. Some translations say it was the still small voice. It's kind of an odd word. Here in Elijah, for Elijah, God's presence was not in these remarkable shock and awe things. It was not in fire or wind or an earthquake, but in the quiet that came after. In the silence that would likely make us feel uncomfortable. God was known to him in silence and spoke to him in silence. So too we find the disciples in our gospel text confronted with shock and awe, having their own, again, mountaintop, or at least metaphorical mountaintop experience. As we read last week, Jesus has just fed 5,000 men and women and children, so 10, 15,000 people or more. And as Jesus decides to dismiss the crowd, he sends the disciples back across the lake in a boat. And then he goes up a mountain to pray by himself, which is probably what he had intended to do all along anyway. The crowd just followed him around. And it says, in the early morning, he looks out from the mountain and sees the boat far away from the shore, battered by the waves. The disciples are surrounded by a shock and awe of sorts and are fearing for their lives. And into that, then, Jesus comes, walking on the water. He's not running, it says. He's not jumping. He's not hurtling over waves like he's some athlete at a triathlon or something. He comes walking to them on the water. And naturally, the disciples, not having seen anything like this before, are terrified, thinking, who else walks on a water but a ghost? So it must be a ghost coming toward us. And Jesus comforts them, says, it is I, do not be afraid. And then Peter asks then to come out on the water with them. If it is truly God, if it is truly Jesus, command me to come out. And that still small voice tells him simply, come. And so he does. Peter walks then out on the water for a time, loses his faith briefly, and then when Jesus and Peter get back into the boat, the storm stops. The winds cease. Jesus didn't even have to say anything to command them. And it is then that the disciples turn and worship him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. They didn't worship him as Son of God after the miraculous healings, not after the miraculous bread, but rather in the silence after a storm, sitting in the presence of Jesus in the boat. Not in the spectacle, but in the quiet life of a Jewish rabbi. I think we seek God in the spectacle, and if we only seek him in spectacle, we are missing the point. It's kind of like a wedding and a marriage, or, say, all the work needed for, or in reverse, all the work needed to get a degree, and then the ceremony of the degree, of the graduation. You might remember your wedding quite vividly. I remember a few things, though I'm not going to say them to not embarrass my wife. But a wedding is a grand ordeal, a spectacle. We're encouraged into that by our culture, not least of which because they charge more if it's a wedding as opposed to a family event, something I found out after we were married. That's a tip you can give to all your kids and grandkids. If they're planning a wedding, tell them it's a family event, not a wedding, and the rates will be a little better. So I've heard. But yes, there is grand spectacle, and a wedding is a good and proper thing, and there is much to do, and it's wonderful and joyous, but it's not a marriage. It's the beginning of a marriage, to be sure, but the marriage itself is in the day in and day out. Saying goodbye and I love you before you leave. A kiss goodnight. The little things over and over and over again. And yes, occasionally there will be spectacle, there will be arguments, there will be all sorts of things. But the day-to-day is what makes a marriage. So too with God's presence among us. We might want the spectacle, and that is okay. But we should recognize that the spectacle comes few and far between. Elijah was one man amongst 7,000 faithful in Israel. Moses was one in, several 100,000 or 1,000,000. Instead, what Paul tells us in Romans, that now our word of faith, what he proclaims to us, what we believe is this, that the word is near you, on your lips and in your heart. God is not absent from us because we don't have these remarkable, spectacular moments all the time. Rather, Paul tells us that God is indeed near us, as close as our hearts and our lips, as close as Jesus, brought to us in flesh, like us in all ways but sin. God is not found only in these spectacles, but more fully found in perhaps the mundane. As we teach in our Eucharist, he is found in the simplest of foods, bread and wine. He's found in the quiet profession of our faith in the daily office. He's found in the fellowship shared, simply sitting with each other. Yes, God is known by his power, surely, and shock and awe. But he is most fully known through his Son, someone who is human like us. And so if you think, then, or if you're worried that perhaps God is not present among us because there is not thunder from the rooftops or a bright shining light coming out of the altar, I would ask you to consider then, again, our text today, and that God is not always present in such things. But for Elijah, it was a still, small voice. For the disciples, it was the calm of a storm. And for Paul, as he encourages us, the word of faith that we proclaim is this: he is here with you. The word is indeed near you. Amen.